It's relatively often that I receive a comment or a message from somebody who is a regular viewer of the videos on the YouTube channel or a regular listener to my podcast who says, I didn't know you wrote a book on this topic or that topic, when I just happened to mention it offhand. So I thought it would be worthwhile to just do a quick overview of what the books are that I've written in case you have interest in any of these topics. So I'm going to go through these. You can find a lot of these at justincenter.org, not all of them. Those are the ones that are published through our publishing house. The others, you can find links on jordanbcooper.com, which is my personal website. And you can also just look them up on, Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com or whatever, and you should be able to find them a number of different places. All right, so the first of these, this is the first book I wrote. It's called The Righteousness of One, an evaluation of early patristic soteriology in light of the new perspective on Paul, with a foreword by Peter Leithart. This work is, it's a pretty slim one. It's pretty short. It's about 140-ish pages, but this was a master's thesis I wrote when I was studying at the Wittenberg Institute, and this is a treatment of, just like the title sounds like, looking at the soteriology, the doctrine of salvation within the Church Fathers, and looking at it with an eye to asking the question, did the early fathers understand Paul in the way that the New Perspective on Paul authors did, or did they understand Paul in a way that was similar to how Martin Luther and the other reformers understood Paul? What I'm not arguing for is to say that all of the Church Fathers all agreed with Martin Luther on everything, but it's essentially to say that some of the questions that someone like N.T. Wright says are medieval are questions that these early Christian writers are asking, and there isn't enough attention paid to that in some of these discussions. This is, at the time, New Perspective was kind of the hot debate. Maybe not as much as it is, not as much today. Second book, this is Christification, a Lutheran Approach to Theosis. If you know any of my books, you have probably heard of this one. This one is also relatively short here. It's 130 pages, but it's a little bigger size, so it's actually a little bit longer than the other one, word-wise. This is a take on theosis. It's an explanation of what the Eastern doctrine of theosis is, what a Lutheran formulation of the doctrine of theosis would be in response to that, and then what are some kind of differences between a Lutheran approach and then what would be an Eastern Orthodox approach to theosis. This is definitely the book that is the most cited in scholarly publications. It's been cited in a number of dissertations and published articles, and it's had a number of reviews all over the place. Generally very positive reviews outside of Lutheranism, and very negative reviews among certain kinds of Lutherans, which, that's all right. That's kind of what I get for most of my books, to be honest with you. Okay, next book here is The Great Divide, a Lutheran Evaluation of Reformed Theology. This one also pretty big seller here, and this was really it was a writing that was my thought process in my moving from a Reformed to a Lutheran approach to theology. And this really began as a series of just blog posts that I was writing personally as a way to kind of express my thoughts. But it wasn't, I didn't have a major public platform or anything at the time. It was just a way for me to kind of catalog what I was thinking and ideas I was thinking through. I tend to write or think as I write. Writing helps me to process a lot. So I did that. Eventually I realized maybe I should actually put this into a book. So I took a lot of those thoughts, made it into separate essays on different topics, and then it became this book. So if you are curious about the Lutheran faith from a Reformed perspective, this is really the book you want to pick up. If you are a Lutheran who's curious about Reformed theology, this is also helpful in that regard, I think, as well. All right, next book that I have here. This is a popular level book here. This one's called Baptized into Christ, A Guide to the Christian Life. And this was something that just grew out of a series of Bible studies I did with a congregation when I was in full-time parish ministry. And it's really just a basic overview of what it means to live a Christian life. And it is very much formed from that Lutheran perspective. So it talks about the sacramental life, vocation, the two kinds of righteousness, and a lot of those key Lutheran categories. So if you're looking for something more basic, introductory, this is probably the one that you want to look at. Now, I have a few of these that I actually don't have in like actual print form here, because I have this tendency to just give books away when people come to visit. And so because of that, I constantly am giving away all copies of my own books, and I have to reorder copies of my own books. So the next ones here, I have Lex Aeterna, a defense of the Orthodox Orthodox Lutheran Doctrine of God's Law and Critique of Gerhard Forde. That work is as it sounds like, a defense of the idea of the law being eternal. So it's a criticism of the school of thought that is often given the title Radical Lutheranism, coming from an essay that Gerhard Forde wrote for Lutheran Quarterly. And so it's a critique of Gerhard Forde and Stephen Paulson more than anybody else. But it's also an explanation of what is it that Lutherans have historically believed about the law. I counter a lot of, I think, unfortunate portrayals of the law that tend to show up in a lot of polemics against Lutheranism, specifically Roman Catholic polemics. So this notion that the law is something that is maybe temporary or that it is kind of arbitrary, this voluntarist conception of the law. I challenge all of that to say the law in Lutheranism, historically, including in the confessional tradition, which defines what Lutheranism is affirms that the law is eternal, and the law is something that is not arbitrary or separable from the divine nature, but what the law is, it's the external display in moral terms of God's own very essence and nature. So that is called Lex Aeterna. Next, I have Liturgical Worship, and this is a Liturgical Worship, a Lutheran Introduction. That book is definitely my best-selling book. It's one that has been used in a lot of congregations to walk a congregation through understanding what the liturgical service is about. That is a lay-level book. It is also a Bible study, essentially, that I did with a church going in our Bible study hour. I just went through elements of the liturgy and put together outlines to explain, what does this mean? Where does this come from? What's the biblical foundation of this? What's the history of this element of the service? Why is it that we should prefer liturgical worship? Is this just some kind of preference for tradition, or is there some deeper reason why it is that we should value liturgical worship? So that book, Liturgical Worship, a Lutheran Introduction. Next one is Hands of Faith, a historical and theological study of the two kinds of righteousness in Lutheran thought. That work is by far my worst-selling book. So it's the one that nobody reads for whatever reason. I don't know. But I liked it enough. It's a relatively short book as well, but what it is, it's a study of this Lutheran idea of the two kinds of righteousness, which is really key for how we understand the relationship between justification and sanctification, or salvation, as people often speak of it, really justification and good works. And it formulates what is the two kinds of righteousness paradigm that appears within Luther's own writings, and it is then also talked about in the history of Lutheran thought. It's been discussed more recently, especially in relation to Luther. What I wanted to do is take that and demonstrate that there was this continuity between Luther and then a later Lutheran tradition. So I'm showing this kind of stream of two kinds of righteousness thought throughout. There's some criticism of some contemporary formulations and models of the two kinds of righteousness in that text as well. All right, so those are the ones that I don't have actually on hand. Then we're getting to my series that has taken a lot of my focus and time at this point, and it's what I'm going to make really my life's work, is putting this series together. And that is this set. It's called A Contemporary Protestant Scholastic Theology. And the goal of this is really to be a systematic theology of sorts. I don't know that it's going to cover every single topic, but it is an explanation of why it is that the classical approach to philosophy and the relationship between philosophy and theology is necessary for us today, but I am applying that within a Protestant context. So I'm criticizing a lot of theological movements coming out of especially the 19th century that were kind of anti-metaphysical, and defending classical metaphysic, classical realism, kind of a Neoplatonic realism. There is a bit of use of figures like Thomas Aquinas and Peter Lombard, as well as 17th century Lutheran scholastics. Johann Gerhard is probably the most prominent name within this series. But it's a planned 9-volume series. I have like 3 other volumes I'm kind of considering as well adding to it, but we'll just see how this goes, because it's a lot of work. This is a hardcover version. There's a paperback version as well. But this is Volume 1, Prolegomena, Defense of the Scholastic Method. And this one is a defense, really, of the use of classical philosophy in the formation of Christian theology, and a bit of a defense of Luther against a lot of critics. So, and these are bigger texts than some of the other ones. Then this is volume 6 in that series. This is a proof copy here, but because I gave away my other copies. And this one is Union with Christ, Salvation as Participation. This volume these are released out of order, but clearly. So this one is a book that I just really wanted to write, and this is probably the one I like the most of anything that I've written. This text is, as it sounds, a book on union with Christ, but this is part of what is going to be 2 volumes that are kind of companion volumes in this series. And the first is Justification, Salvation as Forensic Declaration, and second is Union with Christ, Salvation as Participation. So I'm kind of trying to talk about these twin elements of salvation as the forensic element and then the participatory element. The participatory is what I wrote about here and focused on. This is very much an expansion of the Christification volume, so this is really a treatment of theosis in a fuller sense within a Lutheran theological context. You don't have to be Lutheran to read these books, by the way. I really do write these purposefully to be texts that will be useful far outside of the Lutheran tradition. So this is not just like I'm writing for Lutherans. I've never wanted to just speak to Lutherans only. I don't think that's healthy, and that's kind of the entire purpose of everything that I do. That's why this organization, Justice Center, exists, is to not do that. So I hope that you'll find these books helpful, even if it's not your own theological tradition. I think that you will probably find some benefit, hopefully, and insight from these theologians whose work I'm highlighting. This next one, this is one that I didn't write the entirety of, but I was an editor of it along with Matt Finn. And this is the first of the volumes of essays from the Widener Institute, and this is on the doctrine of justification. So theological essays from the Widener Institute, the doctrine of justification. The doctrine of sanctification one is actually complete now. It's just finished going through the editing process. So I don't have a release date on that yet, but it is going to be soon. And I've said that for a while, but there was a holdup in a couple of the articles. So that's done. So it's actually completed at this point. I have an essay in here I wrote the introductory essay, but I wrote an essay on the active obedience of Christ and challenges to that, and then formulate a biblical theological approach to active obedience that differs from some approaches that just kind of do exegetical work in Romans 5, which I actually think has nothing to do with the active obedience of Christ at all. But nonetheless, I'm not giving up on active obedience. I think there are other grounds for it. So there's the doctrine of justification. Next book here. Okay. In Defense of the True, the Good, and the Beautiful, on the Loss of Transcendence and the Decline of the West. This is hopefully the beginning of another set of books that I'm going to be writing. I'm writing one of those right now. And this is something that it's not a strictly theological text. And this is something that is a little bit broader. And that's not to say it's not theological. I think theology is the chief of the sciences. And it certainly relates to all of this, of course. But it's not getting into theological debate. So this is something that even if you are, say, not a Christian, but are wondering how the world got to the place that it is today, you would hopefully be able to benefit from and learn from. So this goes through the transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful. And it is a story, essentially, of how it is that we moved from that classical Platonic, Neoplatonic, Aristotelian, Thomistic approach to these things and toward a post-Enlightenment and now kind of post-structuralist approach where these things are really collapsing in our culture. So it's a big, broad overview text, and that also means that, there are critiques of certain things that I do in here because I don't give enough nuance to certain things, but that is what happens with a broad overview text. That's just, you kind of have to summarize things a little quickly. So, but nonetheless, this one has been, people seem to really like this book. This one has been read quite a bit, and people have spoken quite highly of this in comparison to some of my other works, I think because it has a probably broader readership just because of the nature of the topic. So if you're kind of curious about cultural issues, how we got to where we are today, this is the book that you want to read. Following up on this is a text that I'm currently writing, which is it's based on is the Makers of the Modern World series in my on my podcast and on the channel. That's becoming a book that's probably going to be titled Makers of the Modern Mind rather than World, because I realize that probably doesn't give the clear impression that I'm talking about just thinkers here, because plenty of people have changed the world that aren't really like academics. So probably going to change the title a little bit. That's going to kind of follow up on this, and there's another book that I'm also writing that's going to follow up on this, which is a approach to the gentleman, to say, how is it that we should confront these issues, and what is a model of living that gives a positive vision and a way to move forward in spite of the loss of the transcendentals in our world. And then I have my final and most recent book here. And this is The Doctrine of God, A Defense of Classical Christian Theism. This is volume 2 in Contemporary Protestant Scholastic Theology. And so this is it's a discussion of classical theism and a critique of theistic personalism, as it's often been called, or theistic mutualism. Essentially, it is an argument in favor of the classical model of the attributes of God. So I talk about 4 attributes, and then I discuss the nature of divine or Trinitarian theology and social Trinitarianism. So it covers divine simplicity, divine immutability, divine impassibility, and then divine atemporality. And after that, I present social Trinitarianism and talk about why that model is inadequate. So now I'm currently, I mentioned 2 books that I'm currently writing. I'm also writing another one. I read too much at once, and this is maybe a problem. But I'm also currently writing a book that is going to be the 3rd volume in this series, which is on the doctrine of man. It's a theological anthropology. And that some of the research that I've actually done on that particular issue, wanting to write this book, is partially really what led me toward making that Makers of the Modern World series, because I feel like if I'm dealing with anthropology, I have to deal with kind of modern takes on anthropology and philosophical approaches today that dominate in the academy. So that is what led me toward doing a lot of that kind of work. But that is currently in the works. I have a basic outline of where I'm going, and I have a couple sections written, but there's a bit more work to do. So plenty more stuff to come. As I said, this is a 9-volume series. 3 of them are out, which means I'm a third of the way done, which is something. But my fear is that as I keep going, I'm going to realize how much more I want to write, and this will probably be a multi-decade project. I mean, that's just what I'm expecting here. So those are all the books that I have written. You can go to jordanbcooper.com if you want to find more and links to all of those. A lot of these are at justinsinner.org. You can look any of them up on Amazon. And if you do purchase any of these books, or you have purchased them and you have read them and you liked it, please leave a review. I know that I've seen, especially this book, see a lot of people leaving positive comments about this book on Twitter and Facebook and all over the place, but they're not putting reviews up on Amazon or Goodreads, and those really do help in terms of visibility. And so I really would appreciate if you would add a review. Even if you write just a sentence of why you like the book, that's great. Don't do it if you haven't read the book, but if you have read the book, it would be very helpful if you would do that. So thanks so much, and make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel if you have not already. We'll see you in the next video. God bless.